Ever get that feeling? Like you just want to like really dig into some big idea, question everything. What's right, what's wrong, how society should actually work. Yeah, I know that feeling.
Well, good news. That's kind of the whole point of what we do here, taking, some serious philosophy and breaking it down, especially for you, the listener, who's obviously into this kind of stuff already.
Absolutely. And today, it's John Stuart Mill. We're
Yeah.
going deep into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry. I mean, if philosophers trust it, it's got to be solid, right?
For sure. Mill, he was a powerhouse in 19th century British thought. Contributed to logic, ethics, political philosophy, the whole nine yards. Philosophers still talk about him all the time.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And even though he did a ton in logic and all that, it's his moral and political philosophy that really sticks with us. Utilitarianism and liberalism, those frameworks, they keep the debates going. And we're going to really dissect those, focusing on his big works, utilitarianism and on liberty, of course, with that extra philosophical lens. You know what I mean?
Yeah, we're going to look at where his ideas came from, unpack his core arguments, and then see how those played out in his views on things like political and sexual equality. Super relevant stuff, even today.
So, first things first, got to set the stage. Mill didn't just pop out of thin air with these ideas, right? This philosophical radicalism thing is kind of important, isn't it?
Totally. This is a
Wow.
whole movement led by guys like Jeremy Bentham and John Austin. And get this, James Mill, John Stewart's dad. They were all about using utilitarian principles to critique and reform institutions, like using philosophy for actual social change, based on reason and evidence. Ambitious stuff.
And for our listeners who need a quick refresher, utilitarianism basically boils down to judging actions and institutions based on how they impact overall happiness, right? Greatest happiness for the greatest number, that whole deal.
And here's where it gets interesting from a philosophical perspective. This idea, while simple on the surface, was actually super radical for its time. It challenged the existing power structures and hierarchies by insisting that everyone's happiness matters equally. Not just the elite, not just the privileged, everyone. It was a truly universal and impartial approach. Pretty mind-blowing, really.
Yeah, totally disruptive to the status quo. But Mill, despite being raised in this utilitarian world, didn't just take it all at face value. He had his own intellectual struggles, that mental crisis everyone talks about, and it really pushed him to re-examine the work of Bentham and even his own father.
Right. That period of introspection led him to question some of the core assumptions about human psychology and social theory that his predecessors were working with. I mean, some scholars even suggest that Mill might have downplayed just how much he disagreed with them, maybe out of respect for his father or to maintain a sense of continuity.
Family dynamics and philosophical disagreements all rolled into one. It's fascinating, really. And our source even mentions that James Mill thought his son had defected from the utilitarian cause.
Yeah.
I mean, that's got to sting, right? Talk about a strong difference of opinion.
It definitely highlights the significant shift in thinking that John Stuart Mill brought to the table. And within this whole radical circle, there is a huge debate about psychological egoism. That's the idea that every single human action is ultimately motivated by self-interest. Pretty cynical, if you ask me.
Yeah, definitely a bit bleak.
Oh.
And James Mill seemed to really buy into this idea, right? He believed that people are driven by a desire for power, essentially to control others and get what they want. Not exactly a rosy view of human nature.
Bentham, on the other hand, while focusing mainly on self-interest, did sometimes acknowledge that there could be other motives, like sympathy. But even he saw those as weaker or less reliable than selfish desires, especially when it came to politics and shaping society.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. This whole understanding of human motivation directly fed into the radicals' arguments for democratic reform. I mean, talk about applied philosophy.
Right. They were basically saying, look, if rulers are mostly self-interested, the best way to make sure they actually govern in the people's interests is to hold them accountable through democracy. That connection between a theory of human motivation and specific political structures, that's prime philosophical thinking right there.
So we've got the intellectual context. Now let's get into Mill's own version of utilitarianism. He takes this foundation, but really makes it his own, adding complexity and nuance, right?
Absolutely. He takes the core idea of maximizing happiness, but completely reframes how we think about motivation and the nature of happiness itself. These are crucial distinctions, especially if you want to fully grasp his ethical theory.
Our source points out that some people, even heavy hitters like Henry Sidgwick, interpreted Mill as a psychological egoist. They base this on, among other things, Mill's proof of utility in utilitarianism. Makes sense, right?
Yeah, at first glance it seems that way. Mill says happiness is the only thing we truly desire, which suggests we're all ultimately self-interested. But if you dig deeper into his other writings, you get a more nuanced picture.
The source really digs into this. Looking beyond that specific section in utilitarianism, you see, Mill had his doubts about psychological egoism and even about just focusing on the quantity of pleasure.
Exactly. In his notes on his dad's book, Analysis of the Phenomena of the Human Mind, Mill points out a tricky ambiguity. He separates the ownership of a desire, like the fact that it's your desire, from the content of that desire. Just because you have a desire doesn't mean it's automatically all about your own pleasure. That's a big philosophical distinction that really challenges the whole idea of psychological egoism.
So it's like, yeah, we act on our desires, but those desires don't necessarily have to be selfish at their core.
Right. And Mill makes a similar point in his remarks on Bentham's philosophy. He points out that Bentham himself includes sympathy as a kind of interest, implying that we can care about others for their own sake. It's like Mill saying, look, just because we experience our own desires, it doesn't mean those desires are always focused on ourselves. That's a subtle but crucial philosophical point.
So Mill wasn't just a simple egoist. Now, let's talk about his famous higher pleasures idea. He was definitely pushing back against the idea that utilitarianism is just about basic animalistic pleasure, right? That's a critique that still comes up a lot in philosophy.
Oh, for sure. He was worried that if utilitarianism was just about maximizing the amount of pleasure, then people would think it was like a philosophy for pigs. So he argues that some pleasures, like intellectual and artistic pursuits, are qualitatively superior to basic physical pleasures.
And at first, he seems to be saying that these higher pleasures are better because they lead to more pleasure overall, maybe by helping us grow intellectually or find more lasting satisfaction.
A Benthamite could totally argue that, right? Like, engaging in these higher pursuits just leads to more happiness overall. But Mill goes further. He says these intellectual pleasures have an intrinsic value, something that makes them better in themselves, not just because they lead to more good stuff later on.
And this is where the competent judge comes in, right? Someone who has experienced both higher and lower pleasures and can make an informed judgment about which is preferable.
Exactly. And Mill's whole point is that this competent judge would always pick the higher pleasure, even if it came with some downsides or discomfort. This implies a qualitative difference that can't be captured by just adding up pleasure and pain. It's a direct challenge to Bentham's purely quantitative approach.
And that's exactly where many traditional hedonists take issue with Mill, right? They question whether this whole higher pleasures idea actually fits with a consistent hedonistic view.
For sure. It's a big point of contention. It seems like Mill uses the word pleasure in a couple of different ways. Sometimes he means a subjective feeling, and sometimes he means the objective activity or pursuit itself.
So the question is, what does he value more? The feeling of pleasure you get from doing something or the actual activity itself?
Our source makes a strong case for the latter. It seems like Mill sees higher pleasures as objective, like engaging in intellectual inquiry, appreciating art, seeking knowledge. He's not just talking about the intensity or duration of a feeling, but about whole modes of existence. It goes beyond mere subjective experience.
So it's not just about feeling good. It's about doing things that are inherently valuable, even if they don't always make you feel amazing in the moment.
Exactly. He even says that competent judges would choose these higher pleasures, even though knowing it to be attended with a greater amount of discontent. Subjective pleasure isn't the ultimate deciding factor for Mill in these cases.
Okay, so if it's not just about maximizing pleasant feelings, what else is driving Mill's valuation of these higher activities? Our source brings up perfectionist elements in his thinking.
Right. Perfectionism, in this context, suggests that true human flourishing, and therefore true happiness, involves developing and using our unique human capacities, our reason, intellect, moral sense. There's a hint of this in On Liberty when he talks about grounding utility in the permanent interests of man as a progressive being.
And remember that powerful line, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." It perfectly captures that idea that human fulfillment isn't just about being content, it's about striving for something more.
Totally. And Mill emphasizes this constantly. Self-reflection, critical thinking, using your brain and your moral compass, that's all crucial for progress, both individually and for society as a whole. He talks about this a lot in A System of Logic, too.
So it seems like we've got these different ideas about the good in Mill's work. Hedonism, desire satisfaction, and this perfectionism thing. How do philosophers usually try to make sense of all these seemingly different elements?
Yeah, that's one of the big challenges in Mill's scholarship. Our source acknowledges that there's still debate about how consistent his views really are. The perfectionist reading offers one way to tie it all together. It suggests that, for Mill, true happiness is about exercising those higher capacities, and that the competent judge's preferences show us what those objectively valuable activities are. And those higher pleasures, well, they are those very activities themselves.
That definitely paints a more nuanced picture of Mill's concept of happiness. Now, let's talk about his views on duty. How does his utilitarian framework translate into ideas about right and wrong action, which is obviously a major concern in ethical theory?
Mill sticks with the utilitarian tradition and believes that right action ultimately promotes happiness. His proportionality doctrine reflects this. But how exactly individual actions connect to that big goal of maximizing happiness? Well, that's complicated. That's where we get the distinction between direct and indirect utilitarianism.
For those of our listeners who might need a quick philosophy refresher, could you break down that difference?
Sure, direct utilitarianism, especially the ACT utilitarian version, says we should judge each action based on its likely impact on overall happiness. Indirect utilitarianism, however, suggests we should follow moral rules or principles that are themselves justified by their tendency to promote happiness. Rule utilitarianism is a classic example of this indirect approach.
So, where does Mill fit in all of this? Is he more about the consequences of individual choices, like an act utilitarian, or about following general moral rules, like a rule utilitarian?
The source highlights that several passages in utilitarianism, especially in Chapter 2, point towards act utilitarianism. Mill talks about right and wrong in terms of whether an action increases or decreases happiness, which suggests a focus on specific actions in specific situations.
But there's also that well-known interpretation, mainly pushed by J.O. Urmson, that Mill was actually a rule utilitarian. They point to Mill's emphasis on secondary moral principles.
Yeah, Urmson argues that when Mill talks about the tendency of actions to produce good or bad results, he's mainly talking about the general tendency of a type of action, not individual instances. Like, truth-telling usually promotes happiness, so we should follow that rule. However, our source pushes back on this. They note that even Bentham, one of Mill's big influences, often attributed felicific tendency, that tendency to produce happiness, to specific actions, not just types.
And what about those secondary principles that Mill keeps bringing up? Things like keeping promises, being truthful, being fair. How do those fit into his utilitarian system?
Mill says these principles are crucial for actually putting utilitarianism into practice. They're like guidelines based on human experience that generally lead to greater happiness. He contrasts this with the idea that these principles are just self-evident moral truths. For Mill, their value comes from their track record of promoting well-being.
But he also makes it clear that they're not absolute. They can be overridden if sticking to them would lead to really bad outcomes or when they clash with each other.
Exactly. He sees these rules as super important for everyday moral decisions, but ultimately, they're grounded in the big principle of utility. They're good rules of thumb, but not inflexible commands. That's a key difference between him and strict rule utilitarians.
That's a subtle but super important point for understanding Mill's ethical theory. Now, the source also brings up sanctioned utilitarianism from Chapter 5 of Utilitarianism. What's that all about?
So, sanctioned utilitarianism defines wrongness and duty in terms of whether it's appropriate to punish or blame someone for an action. Like, is it fitting for someone to feel guilty or for society to impose a penalty? If so, then the action is wrong.
So it's not just about the direct consequences of an action. It's about whether our responses to that action are justified.
Right. Mill suggests this helps differentiate between actions that are just sort of undesirable and those that are truly morally wrong. Not every action that fails to maximize happiness is necessarily wrong in a moral sense. Wrongness, in this context, is about whether it's appropriate to blame or punish.
It seems like this could address some of those classic criticisms of utilitarianism, like the difficulty of explaining different categories of right and wrong actions.
Yeah, sanctioned utilitarianism seems to give us a way to distinguish between things that are wrong, permissible, obligatory, and even supererogatory, based on whether it's fitting to blame or praise those actions. But our source points out a potential problem. The theory seems to mix direct and indirect utilitarianism. Duty is defined indirectly, through sanctions, but the justification for those sanctions seems to appeal directly to utility utilitarian. We should sanction actions if doing so promotes overall happiness. This can create some inconsistencies within the theory.
So Mill's view of duty is multifaceted, to say the least, and still a hot topic in philosophy. Now, we can't talk about Mill without discussing his proof of utility in Chapter 4. It's famous, or maybe infamous, depending on who you ask.
Oh, yeah, the proof that has caused its fair share of debate. Some even question whether Mill was being philosophically rigorous here. He's trying to show that happiness is the only thing desirable in itself, and he basically argues that the only proof that something is desirable is that people actually desire it. And then he claims that everyone ultimately desires their own happiness.
And that's where a lot of philosophers jump in with objections. They point out that he might be playing fast and loose with the word desirable, that you can't go from what people do desire to what they should desire, and that it's hard to combine everyone's individual desires into a single desire for general happiness.
Our source does a great job summarizing these common criticisms. They point out that Mill might be confusing can be desired with worthy of being desired, that he's trying to get a should from an is, that maybe not everyone solely desires their own happiness, and that it's a big leap from individual desires to a collective desire for everyone's happiness.
It's like a minefield of philosophical arguments, ripe for unpacking and analyzing. But our source also offers a more generous interpretation of what Mill might be trying to do.
Right. This more charitable reading suggests that Mill isn't just saying desire equals desirability. Instead, he might be saying that our most deeply held, considered desires are the best guide we have for figuring out objective value. He could be arguing that through introspection and reflection, we realize that happiness is what we ultimately value for its own sake. And he might be saying that true morality, unlike self-interest, requires an impartial concern for everyone's happiness.
So in this view, utilitarianism isn't justified by some naive psychological egoism, but by the inherent impartiality of our moral judgments. That's a lot more convincing.
Definitely. It's like saying prudence is about your own well-being, but morality takes a step back and aims at the well-being of all sentient beings. And Mill might argue that utilitarianism is the most logical and principled way to understand and put this impartial concern into practice.
Okay, one last thing on Mill's utilitarianism. What about the sanctions of utility he talks about in Chapter 3?
So here, Mill tackles the question of what motivates people to actually follow utilitarian principles and what gives those principles their authority. He knows people worry about potential conflicts between individual happiness and the need to promote everyone's happiness.
It's like, what if doing the right thing makes you personally unhappy?
Right. And Mill's response is that this kind of conflict isn't unique to utilitarianism. It's a problem for any ethical theory that asks us to go beyond just our own self-interest. He argues that external sanctions, like legal punishment or social disapproval, and internal sanctions, like guilt or remorse, can help bridge this gap. These sanctions provide the motivational push to act in accordance with the greater good, even when it might require some personal sacrifice.
So he's saying we need these motivators, both from outside and within ourselves, to nudge us towards doing the right thing, even when it's hard.
Exactly. While Mill might have thought the demands of utilitarianism were reasonable in his time, our source points out that there's an ongoing debate about how demanding utilitarianism actually is, especially now that we're more aware of global suffering and interconnectedness. Thinkers like Peter Singer argue that if we take utilitarianism seriously, it implies a much greater obligation to help others, potentially requiring big lifestyle changes for those of us living in affluent societies.
So even though Mill laid the groundwork, the practical implications and the perceived burden of utilitarianism are still hotly debated in moral philosophy. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground on Mill's utilitarianism. Let's shift gears now and dive into his other major contribution, liberalism, as expressed in On Liberty.
On Liberty, his most influential work and still widely read today, he starts by making a distinction between traditional threats to freedom, like kings and aristocrats, and a new threat that arises in democracies, the tyranny of the majority.
It's a powerful insight that even in a society ruled by the people, individuals can have their freedom suppressed by public opinion or the will of the majority. That's a huge contribution to political philosophy. And Mill's solution to this problem is his famous one very simple principle.
Yes, the harm principle. It states that the only legitimate reason for society to exercise power over an individual, whether through the government or social pressure, is to prevent harm to others. Someone's own good, even if it's for their own moral well-being, is not enough to justify interfering with their freedom.
So this principle puts up a strong barrier against both paternalism, where we force someone to act in their own best interest,
Right.
and moralism, where we force people to conform to a specific moral code just because society thinks it's right.
Precisely. Mill's point is that we can reason with, persuade, or plead with people, but we can't force them or punish them just because we think they're harming themselves or because we disapprove of their choices. The only exception is if their actions directly harm others. This principle is foundational for Mill's defense of individual liberty and what we now consider basic liberal rights.
But philosophers often point out a potential tension here. Mill is a utilitarian, which is generally a consequentialist approach. How does this strong commitment to individual liberty, as expressed in the harm principle, fit with a framework that prioritizes maximizing overall good outcomes?
That's a big question in Mill scholarship. Utilitarianism, especially the direct forms, usually judges actions and policies based on their overall effect on happiness, which means sometimes individual interests might be sacrificed for the greater good. Deontological or rights-based theories, on the other hand, argue that certain duties or rights are fundamental and can't be violated no matter the consequences. The harm principle seems more aligned with these latter approaches.
So how does Mill reconcile this apparent clash between the consequentialism of utilitarianism and the seemingly deontological nature of the harm principle?
His defense of basic liberties starts with freedom of thought and expression. He argues that understanding why free speech is so important can help us justify a broader commitment to other fundamental liberties.
And he lays out a few key arguments in favor of free speech.
Right. Yeah. Our source breaks them down into two main categories: truth-tracking and deliberative. The truth-tracking argument says that open and free discussion, even of unpopular or false ideas, is the best way to arrive at the truth over time. It's like a marketplace of ideas where the best ones will win out through reason and debate.
That reminds me of Justice Holmes and his clear and present danger test, and the whole concept of the marketplace of ideas.
Right. But Mill goes beyond that with his deliberative rationale. He says that even true and widely accepted beliefs need to be challenged and debated so they don't become stale dogma. This constant process of justification and critical engagement is crucial for intellectual vitality, personal autonomy, and our growth as rational and progressive beings.
So it's not just about finding the truth. It's about constantly questioning and understanding the reasons why we believe something is true.
Exactly. And this intellectual freedom, this willingness to consider different viewpoints, also encourages experimentation and diversity in how people live their lives. Mill sees this as essential for both individual and societal progress.
It expands what he calls the deliberative menu, giving us more options and helping us understand their strengths and weaknesses. But Mill's not saying that all liberty is good, right? He does recognize some limits.
That's right. He focuses on a set of basic liberties: freedom of conscience and expression, freedom of tastes and pursuits, and freedom of association rather than unlimited freedom. He justifies this distinction by emphasizing the vital role these particular freedoms play in our ability to make choices, form our own character, and pursue our own idea of a good life.
Okay, let's dig a little deeper into the harm principle itself. What exactly does harm mean for Mill? This is something that's still debated in legal and political philosophy, right?
Mill distinguishes between harm, which he sees as a serious setback to someone's rights-based interests, something that's actually injurious, and offense, which is more subjective, temporary, and less serious. He says society shouldn't regulate mere offense, but preventing harm to others is the only legitimate reason to restrict individual liberty. And it's important to note that he acknowledges that harm can be perspective. The risk of harm can be enough to justify action.
And this harm principle applies pretty broadly in Mill's thinking, right? He sees it working in lots of different areas of social life.
Yeah, it's not just about the relationship between the state and individuals. It's also about how people interact within families and communities. He's a big proponent of non-consensual harm, meaning if someone consents to something, they haven't been harmed. This is the whole valenti non fit injuria principle.
But even with this seemingly clear-cut principle, our source points out that it's not always easy to apply. Preventing harm might not always be enough to justify restricting freedom, and sometimes there might be other reasons for intervention.
Right. Mill acknowledges that even if an action might cause harm, that doesn't mean society should automatically step in. There might be good reasons to hold back, like protecting individual autonomy or avoiding unintended negative consequences. This is where we get the distinction between weak sufficiency, where harm is a reason to consider regulation, and strong sufficiency, where harm is a definitive reason to regulate. Our source suggests Mill leans towards the former view.
So the harm principle sets a bar for intervention, but doesn't automatically determine the outcome. It has to be balanced against other factors, including broader utilitarian considerations. What about the idea that harm is necessary for justified regulation? Does Mill ever allow for restrictions when there's no direct harm to others?
Our source points to some apparent exceptions. Things like the duty to testify in court, Good Samaritan laws, and compulsory contributions to things like national defense and public education. Mill tries to frame these as involving harm, but it raises tricky philosophical questions about what counts as harm. Is failing to help someone the same as harming them?
It seems like Mill might have a wider concept of harm that goes beyond just physical or material damage. Maybe it includes things like violating legitimate expectations or undermining social cooperation. He might be leaning towards a harm prevention principle, which focuses on preventing harm in a broader sense, rather than just stopping individuals from directly harming others.
That's a plausible reading. The harm prevention principle is broader and could potentially justify more interventions. And when it comes to public goods, like national defense, the link between an individual's choice not to contribute and harm to others is much less direct. Our source suggests that maybe the harm principle works better if it's understood as applying to restrictions on basic liberties, a basic liberties harm prevention principle.
But even with this more refined version, there seem to be exceptions, especially when it comes to paternalism. Like Mill supports prohibiting people from selling themselves into slavery, even if they choose to do so freely.
You got it. While Mill generally argues against paternalism, using utilitarian arguments about potential abuse and the value of autonomy, the slavery contract example shows a limit to his opposition. Here, the concern for protecting a person's future autonomy seems to outweigh the principle of non-interference. This suggests that some forms of paternalism, specifically those aimed at protecting fundamental capacities, might be justified within his framework.
What about the issue of offense? Mill separates it from harm and generally opposes regulating it, but he does make an exception for public indecency.
Yeah, he allows for prohibiting public indecency, arguing that it can be offensive to others, but this doesn't quite line up with his broader stance against regulating offensive behavior. Our source mentions Joel Feinberg, who offers a more developed Millian view. Feinberg says we can regulate some offensive conduct based on a balancing test. We weigh the seriousness of the offense against the importance of the regulated activity.
And lastly, let's talk about moralism. The idea that we should regulate actions just because they're morally wrong, even if they don't directly harm anyone. Mill seems pretty opposed to this view.
He definitely seems to reject legal moralism as the main justification for limiting freedom. But our source makes a good point. A lot of our criminal laws, while aiming to prevent harm, are also based on moral judgments about what's wrong. It's often the harmfulness that makes something immoral. The big question is whether Mill would be okay with regulating conduct that's considered immoral but doesn't actually hurt anyone. While he rejects strong moralism, which says moral wrongness is enough to justify legal intervention, it's not clear if he'd totally reject weak moralism, which says moral wrongness is a reason to consider regulation.
So Mill's one very simple principle turns out to be pretty complex and nuanced. It requires us to think carefully about what harm is, how it differs from offense, the limits of paternalism, and the role of morality in the law. Now, let's connect all this back to his utilitarianism and his overall liberal philosophy. How does he try to tie these seemingly separate pieces together?
Our source outlines three main strategies that Mill uses to reconcile utilitarianism, rights, and liberalism. The first is his sanction theory of rights from utilitarianism. This theory says a right is basically something society should protect, and the reason we protect it is because doing so promotes overall happiness. It's an indirect utilitarian account of rights.
But philosophers have pointed out some problems with this theory, right? Like, doesn't it seem like rights exist before and justify social enforcement rather than being created by it?
Exactly. Plus, there might be things society finds useful to protect that aren't really rights, like certain privileges or economic advantages. The second strategy is to see rights as secondary principles. These are important moral rules grounded in utilitarianism that we should generally follow, but they can be overridden in extreme cases where doing so would lead to a much better outcome or prevent conflicts between rights.
That lines up with his general view of moral principles as valuable rules of thumb based on utility. What's the third strategy?
The third approach is to understand rights as protecting what we might call preeminent goods. These are crucial aspects of human well-being, things that are essential for a meaningful and autonomous life. This connects to Mill's hierarchy of pleasures and his emphasis on the importance of our ability to think for ourselves. In this view, rights protect these vital elements of human flourishing, and we enforce them because they're so crucial for individual and societal well-being.
It seems like these last two approaches, rights as secondary principles and rights as protectors of essential goods, offer a stronger and more consistent way to understand the relationship between utility and rights in Mill's work than the sanction theory. Now, let's touch on his views on liberal democracy and sexual equality. This is where his philosophical principles really get put into practice.
When it comes to liberal democracy, Mill is a big advocate for representative government and widespread voting rights, but he's not simplistic about it. He believed the ideal form of democracy could change depending on the specific circumstances of a society and the level of civic engagement among its citizens. He supported proportional representation to ensure minority voices are heard, and was worried about the potential for tyranny of the majority, even suggesting things like weighted voting as a temporary measure to give more weight to the views of educated citizens.
And his vision of the common good in a liberal democracy really emphasizes individual self-development. It's about people using their higher intellectual and moral capacities, and the government's role is to make sure everyone has a fair shot at pursuing their own version of a good life.
And he wasn't all about laissez-faire economics either. While generally supporting market economies, he argued for government intervention to address inequality through progressive taxation and to provide essential public goods like infrastructure and education. He also supported regulations to improve working conditions, reflecting a commitment to social justice within a liberal framework. This sets his perfectionist liberalism apart from more libertarian or contemporary forms of political liberalism that emphasize neutrality about what constitutes a good life.
Finally, his arguments for sexual equality and the subjection of women are incredibly progressive for his time and still relevant today.
Absolutely. He makes both consequentialist arguments, saying that oppressing women holds society back by preventing them from fully contributing their talents, and fundamental rights-based arguments based on the principles of individual liberty and the importance of independence for women's happiness. He even compares the legal status of women to slavery and argues passionately for equal opportunities for everyone to thrive and make their own choices. His arguments here show how his utilitarianism and his commitment to freedom and equality work together.
So to wrap up our deep dive, John Stuart Mill was a true intellectual giant whose work continues to shape how we think about ethics and political theory. His ideas, while complex and open to interpretation, are still essential for understanding happiness, duty, liberty, and equality.
His work forces us to grapple with fundamental questions about what constitutes a good life, the proper role of government, and the importance of individual freedom in a thriving society.
And on that note, here's a final thought for our listeners, especially those of you who are philosophically inclined. Given Mill's emphasis on developing our higher capacities and his warnings about conformity and the tyranny of the majority, how do you think his ideas apply to the impact of social media and the power of tech giants on our thoughts and public discourse? Something to ponder, right?
It's a vital question in our digital age.
For sure. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of John Stuart Mill. We've explored his unique take on utilitarianism, his nuanced and influential defense of liberty, the ongoing philosophical puzzle of reconciling utility and rights, and his progressive views on democracy and equality. We encourage you to explore his work further, maybe starting with the Stanford Encyclopedia Philosophy entry we've been discussing. And keep thinking about the questions his work raises. It's worth it.
Hopefully, this deep dive has given you a good grasp of Mill's contributions to philosophy. We're looking forward to our next deep dive, and if there are specific philosophical topics you want us to tackle, let us know. Until then, keep questioning, keep thinking deeply, and keep exploring the world of philosophical ideas.